Hello and welcome back to my video series on giftedness. I am Elke Lenen. If you haven't seen the introduction yet, you can click the link in the description below and get caught up on who I am and on the purpose of this video series. Today's topic is on giftedness and existentialism. It's a broad topic and I won't be talking about everything. So today I'm mainly talking about the general experience of existentialism and what makes giftedness different here. Existentialism really is the realization that we are mortal. Everybody knows that death is coming for us all, but usually this is a fact that is somewhere in the back of our minds. Once we get confronted with existential questions, we are forced to really look at the end of our lives and look at the value of our lives. This can cause many different things, but it just comes down to the reality of life and death becoming more prominent in your mind. So for most people, the realization that you are mortal is not really a personal one. Instead, we all kind of know that we are mortal and it's a fact that we're going to die one day. But this realization is then shoved to the back of our minds so that we can live our lives the way we want to, at least on a day-to-day basis. We are usually not confronted with the personal existential question and the personal realization of mortality until we are in a very real way confronted with the limited time that we have. One way in which that happens is when death comes unannounced and unexpectedly. Traumatic events, near-death experiences, and the traumatic loss of a person who should not have died, those are moments where the mortality and the realization of mortality becomes real and personal and very close. Another moment where this realization becomes personal is at a certain point of your life. The infamous midlife crisis, for example, is a moment where people make the decision to make the most out of their lives as far as they know how, for as long as they have left. The sense of urgency that pushes this crisis is probably caused by the realization that there is less time to go than there is already been. So death is somehow approaching closer and closer, which makes people question what they have been doing so far in their lives. So in summary, most people know that they are mortal, but they kind of take that for granted and still pretend to live indefinitely until they are forced to reckon that death is real and maybe closer than they think. There are several reasons why gifted people, and particularly gifted children, are attracted to existential questions and tend to think about them very intensely. One of the reasons is their inquisitive mind. This means that they chase more difficult questions and tend to push the boundary of what can be answered and what cannot be answered. So usually when they start asking very simple questions out of curiosity, they tend to chase the subject further and further until no answer exists anymore. So a gifted child might start asking what happened to the goldfish, hear that the goldfish died, then keep asking about what death is, and then keep asking about what happens after that, and then find out that nobody really knows. After they find out that nobody really knows the answer to this, they are unlikely to let go of the subject, because in an inquisitive mind, there has to be some kind of answer to this. So they will keep looking for an answer, either by asking it or by ruminating about it, until they finally find an answer that they are happy with. And of course, for existential questions, this is very, very hard to achieve. And especially for a question that is this deeply unsettling, gifted children are unlikely to be emotionally ready for these kinds of questions. So what you get is an inquisitive, gifted child who starts asking questions about life and death, who then becomes troubled by the apparent meaninglessness of life, because nobody can tell them what the meaning of life really is. Another thing that adds to the intensity of the existential experience for gifted people is the way that they are unable to let go. This is slightly different from their inquisitive mind that looks for things that can't be answered. And this is about the amount of energy that they then put into the question and the problem that can't be solved. They are very likely to exhaust themselves thinking about it and then think some more. They are unable to know the boundary of when to let go of a subject, especially when it matters so much to them. This can lead to some kind of a compulsive thinking pattern. You cannot for the life of you stop thinking about this subject. So the rumination doesn't really factor into the making of an existential question of a gifted person, but it definitely adds a lot of weight to it. Another thing that adds to the experience of existentialism, especially for young gifted people, is that they are young and they are not expected to think deeply about existential questions. And they are not supposed to think about the value of their lives, they are just supposed to live and have a good time. The adults that surround them really are usually concerned about the emotional impact of these existential questions on their child's well-being, while the child is really mainly concerned with the existential question itself for its own sake. So what you usually then see is that the adults are trying to convince the gifted child to give up on their existential questioning. And then the gifted child either stops talking about it or pushes back by saying that death is coming for us all, including me. I could be dead tomorrow. I have every right to be thinking about this. How it eventually turns out for most gifted people who experience this kind of conflict is that they are left feeling that although they are factually right, they are not taken seriously in their concerns, in their very real concerns. So they are correct and yet still treated as though they are wrong. They are the wrong ones. That is alienating, it is frustrating, and it definitely adds a layer to their existential questioning by knowing that this is something that I'm not supposed to do. Another thing to keep in mind about existentialism and giftedness is that once existentialism is truly taken seriously, it's unlikely to ever really fade away. You might expect them to grow over it and to let go of it and to grow up having no existential dread or questions or realizations anymore. But existential questions are not answered very lightly. Therefore, your answers to these questions are likely to change over time. And that means that the dread and the questions and the concern are likely to return over time. So once you've seen the real void of death, and once you have really realized the end of your life is eventually coming, that personal realization never truly fades away. So for a gifted person who has taken that issue very seriously very early on, they are likely to be affected by existential questions in some way or another throughout their entire lives. And that's not something necessarily to worry about, but it is something that is, for the gifted person, a normal experience. Well, of course, not every single gifted person is the same. There are a lot of gifted people who take existential questions extremely seriously and become depressed by them. There are some gifted people who take these questions very seriously, come up with their temporary answers and their values to live by, and move on. There are some gifted people who acknowledge existential questions and then kind of adopt the value that life is completely meaningless, take the nihilist approach and run with it, and are completely fine for the rest of their lives. So the experience of gifted people confronting their existential questions and coming up with the way forward varies a lot from person to person. So I can't possibly cover all of that. But the common core that usually exists with most gifted people is that the realization was real and that the realization came very early and usually seemingly unprovoked. In order to provide clarification on one of the perspectives on existentialism, I would like to provide my own perspective on it. I'm a person who thought about existential questions because I started questioning faith and questioning religion, just because there were so many out there. I then started to ask what happens after you die, and nobody really could provide me an answer. I'm not sure how old I was, but I was pretty young. And I remember that my mother told me that I was too young to think about these things. And I was, because it very much upset me. Thinking about the meaning of life led me to think that maybe the life is meaningless, or maybe just my life is meaningless because I haven't found the meaning of my life. So that realization was probably fed by my own insecurity and budding depression, but it definitely fed back into my depression. So it made the whole question a lot more heavy than it otherwise would have been. Eventually, I started thinking about this question late at night, during the day, most of the time, and never really getting an answer. And I was actually physically unable to stop myself from obsessing over this question. And it got to a point where it would physically hurt my head to continue just ruminating about this topic. So upsetting as it was very difficult for me to distract myself from it. And eventually the distraction came in the form of education, because of my determination to chase psychology as a fix to what is the meaning of my life. That doesn't mean that the question is answered indefinitely for me. To this day, I still very seriously fear death. And I still very seriously question the relative value of my life and of life in general. So, from my perspective, it can be extremely difficult to stop asking questions that have no answer and that you have no business asking. And it's very difficult to control. So if you know somebody who deals with a similar thing, know that it will probably return in cycles, and not everything is equally heavy. If there's any comfort to be taken from this, the comfort on my end is that not everything is equally heavy. So I hope that this video has been able to clarify how gifted people stand out when they think about existential questions. If you happen to know somebody who is struggling with this, I hope that I've given you enough basis to understand where they are coming from. If you are yourself struggling with this topic, I hope that you will be able to find the answers that will help you shape your life in a meaningful way. As always, if you have questions or comments, you can email me at the email address that follows. And for now, I will end my talk about existentialism with this. Until my next video, take care.